Right. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's session. My name is Anika Zaumi, and I'm the Community Engagement and Gender Equality Specialist at the Ontario Council for International Cooperation. And it's my absolute pleasure and honor to be able to launch the fall series of Policy Matters and kick off today's session on climate change and the environment with the support and in partnership with Can-Mex Youth Lab, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and Goodall Institute. Before we get started, I do want to do a quick land acknowledgement. I want to recognize that OCIC's office sits on the unceded territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, as it's known within some Indigenous communities as Tiggeronto and known along settler lines as Toronto. And I want to acknowledge that I myself am joining from the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe on Tubro, Wampum Belt, and Dish with One Spoon territory, known along settler lines as St. Catharines, Niagara region. When I think about land acknowledgements, I don't just think about it as simply a way to name the land on which we're joining. And I recognize that all of us are joining from across the province, across the country, and on different unceded territories. And I invite you to, in the chat, to share where you're joining from. But I want us also to think beyond just whose territory we're on, but also recognize that Indigenous communities have and continue to fight for justice. And as our responsibility and role as a settler, and of course, if you yourself are Indigenous, this navigation is different, but our role as a settler on this land is to ensure that we are taking every moment to make sure that we are better equipping ourselves with the skills to stand in solidarity with Indigenous communities. So as you engage with today's session, with today's workshop, I invite you to think through not only climate change and the environment as an overall topic, but also how you are going to be able to take back the lessons you're learning and the skills you're developing from today's session to be a better ally and stand in solidarity with Indigenous communities close to you and across Turtle Island. So I invite you all to take maybe 1 minute or so to reflect on not just where you're joining us from, but also maybe the pieces that you'll be putting into practice or you hope to learn from today to put into practice after today's session. So please join me in holding this space for a minute. Thank you, everyone, for your reflection. And on that note, it is my pleasure to welcome you and introduce our speakers, all of whom are young people from across the world who are joining us to share their own insights and their expertise on issues related to climate change and the environment, reflecting on how they themselves have gotten involved and the skills and tools that they use and put into practice to be better activists on these topics. So I will introduce all of our speakers and share a quick bio. You'll be able to see them on video and maybe they can give us a quick wave when I share their bio. But I'd like to start off with Sumira Bothe. She is from New Brunswick and is a Canadian and German citizen. She's majoring in environmental economics and policy at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And she's interested in environmental policy's role in protecting not just the environment, but also vulnerable communities and people. She's specifically interested in the colonial legacy in America and hopes to focus on Indigenous rights and land sovereignty. So it's with this kind of focus and breadth of understanding that we're very excited to welcome Sumira today, especially in light of this month being the month during which the first National Truth and Reconciliation Day will be celebrated or will be acknowledged and recognized across Canada. Our second speaker is Andrea Gutierrez, who's from Guadalajara, Mexico, and she's currently a law student at the University of Guadalajara and a Can-Mex Can-Mex Youth Lab delegate. She's a passionate debater and has participated in Model UNs representing Germany and was part of the US Embassy in Mexico's American Space Debate Club. Wow. And she's participated and judged in both local and national debate tournaments. Andrea has taken courses from universities like the University of Colorado, Yale, and UC Santa Cruz on a variety of intersectional topics, including feminism, social justice, LGBTQ issues, climate change, among others. So thank you so much to Andrea for joining us today and for sharing your expertise from Can-Mex Youth Lab. Our third speaker is from Jane Goodall Institute. Laura Hernandez is currently serving her second term on Jane Goodall Institute of Canada's Youth Advisor Council. She graduated with a specialization in economics from the University of Ottawa and currently works as a sustainability analyst for Global Affairs Canada. She's a refugee from Colombia, and this has given her a unique lived experience that fuels her passion for inspiring others and driving change. Thank you so much for joining us today, Laura. Our fourth speaker is Kristyn. She sits on the Youth Advisory Council with Laura for the Jane Goodall Institute of Canada and is also in her second term. And she was the chair of the Climate Action Committee during her first term with Jane Goodall. She graduated from Western University with a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Science and Biology and will begin her Master's of Science in Environmental Sustainability at the University of Ottawa this fall. I assume, Kristyn, that you've already started that. So congratulations on starting grad studies. And finally, last but not least, we're joined by Anjali Mehindiratta, who's entering her third year at McGill University studying political science, international development, and history. She recently completed an internship with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which is an award-winning policy and research think tank. During her internship, Anjali conducted research on the differential impacts of climate change on marginalized social groups. Her research interests lie in social justice, gender equality, and political engagement. What a roster we have today, and I'm so glad that all of you can be here to join us and to hear, and I'm so excited to learn. Without further ado, I'd actually like to hand it off firstly to Anjali to start us off with her presentation.
Thank you so much, Anika. I'm super pleased to be here with all of you, and I hope that I can share something interesting. So yeah, my research this past summer was mainly on the topic of social inclusion and the environment. And if we could go to the next slide. So what is the aim of social inclusion? One of the foundational things that we know about climate change is that it has greater and more adverse impacts on those people who are already the most vulnerable. So it's for that reason that it's all the more important to ensure that we're being socially inclusive when we're thinking about how we can respond to climate change and its impacts. So what do I mean by the term social inclusion? So the term social inclusion is to practice to improve the terms of participation in society for every person, and to acknowledge that every individual human has a right to well-being and to work towards realizing this right. This is even more consequential for those members of our society who are already severely marginalized. So incorporating concepts of social inclusion into climate change action ensures that the damages and impacts of climate change aren't going to deepen this marginalization. Next slide. So my research in particular, over the summer, I conducted a literature review and constructed an annotated bibliography with the IISD, or the International Institute for Sustainable Development, to examine the differential vulnerabilities of distinct social groups. So as I'd already mentioned, we already understand that climate change is going to impact the most vulnerable the most severely. But literature and research has tended to give attention to factors like gender and wealth for determining this vulnerability to climate change. And those are definitely important factors, but for this review, myself and my supervisor, Anjali aim to give consideration to social groups whose particular climate change vulnerabilities are probably less examined in the literature. So both in the global context and the Canadian context, I've looked at the climate change vulnerabilities of LGBTQIA2 spirited plus people, people with disabilities, and ethnic minorities, which is what I'm going to be talking to you guys about today. Next slide. So when we set out to do research on LGBTQ plus people and climate change, my supervisor and I were both very cognizant that there might not exist a wealth of literature on the subject. And our initial assumptions about the literature weren't ultimately incorrect. It's not the most populated area of research, But I know I was really amazed to see that there has been some foundational studies and work done on the topic, definitely more than we'd expected, and there's definitely more work to come. So what we learned in our research is that with respect to climate change, the vulnerabilities of the LGBTQ plus community emerge most often in the context of natural disasters and disaster risk reduction, or DRR. So literature on this topic is mostly focusing on how LGBTQ plus people face greater barriers than non-LGBTQ plus people when coping with the effects of events like hurricanes, floods, bushfires, wildfires, and so on, natural disasters that we're expecting to increase in occurrence due to climate change. So while the former are events that are brought about by climate change, we also actually ended up giving some attention to non-climate related disasters, such as earthquakes and typhoons. So these kinds of events kind of subject LGBTQ people to the same hardships that climate-related events would bring about. And there are definitely lessons to be learned from them as well about vulnerability and marginalization. If we could go to the next slide. So there's a lot to go over regarding the key messages I pulled from the literature on the topic, but I'll try to give two of the major points for brevity's sake. The first theme that emerged during our review was that in disaster contexts, LGBTQ people face a heightened chance of violence, discrimination, and hostility. In the aftermath of a natural disaster, residents of the affected areas are often relocated to communal evacuation centers. And these aren't really spaces that offer a ton of privacy or safety. And a lot of LGBTQ plus people reported that they endured increased discrimination and harassment from other evacuees and relief services even. So for an example, following Hurricane Katrina in the New Orleans, there was an instance of a trans woman who was arrested after she tried to access the women's washroom. There's also a lesbian couple in Australia who were unintentionally outed to their small, rural, conservative community after they were forced to evacuate their home in the wake of some pretty severe bushfires. So following the Haitian earthquake of 2010, as another example, LGBTQ plus men and women reported intense hostility in the evacuation camps, and there were also several who relayed, unfortunately, their experiences of both physical and sexual violence from other evacuees. Another dimension of hostility is that many disaster reduction and response plans are intertwined and reliant on faith-based organizations who typically have a strained relationship with members of the LGBTQ plus community. So LGBTQ plus people often report feeling very unsafe or wary of relief efforts spearheaded by religious organizations, and reliance on these services after natural disasters create deeply hostile environments for members of the LGBTQ plus community. The second theme that emerged during the review is that heteronormative disaster relief processes impede recovery for LGBTQ people. So for instance, in demographic lists of evacuees, especially in global South contexts, trans and non-binary individuals often go unaccounted for because these surveys really only account for adult men, women, and children. And that was the case of the Aravanese, who are a third gender group in India who were essentially invisible during relief processes following the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004. So lack of legal recognition can be incredibly consequential for members of the LGBTQ community, and it means that their specific needs and the damages inflicted on them aren't being responded to. So taking the case of Hurricane Katrina again, a lesbian woman whose partner perished in the disaster wouldn't have claim to her spouse's life insurance or the insurance on the house that they shared because their partnership in 2005 wouldn't have been legally recognized. For the surviving partner, this creates an unimaginably challenging circumstance from which it would be incredibly difficult to rebuild. Heteronormative distribution of disaster relief can also be prohibitive for members of the LGBTQ community. So following the earthquake in Haiti, organizations such as UN Food and Red Cross distributed rations to the women heads of households because it's been demonstrated that women will share the food more equitably than would men. But this meant that gay men who at oftentimes were estranged from their families had no way to access emergency food provisions as they didn't have any close female relatives. If we could go to the next slide. So the intent of our literature review was not just to record the vulnerabilities of these groups, but we also wanted to look at the modes of resilience that they demonstrate. So many LGBTQ people are accustomed to potentially hostile societies and environments, and so they possess unique coping mechanisms and skills that non-queer people wouldn't have. So queer people also often possess vast non-familial networks and support system, owing to their position as often marginalized members of society, and the regrettably common circumstance of estrangement from their biological families, especially in global South contexts. In times of crisis, many LGBTQ people have reported success in reliance on these networks and support from them. So, for instance, transgender people in Indonesia were able to evacuate the houses of their friends and acquaintances after a volcanic eruption, rather than being dislocated to the potentially hostile evacuation camps set up by the government. Another interesting case is that of the Baklas, who are a group of gender nonconforming people in the Philippines. So because Baklas are neither man nor woman, they have a capacity to take on both socially male and female tasks and responsibilities. And that's a trait that's definitely advantageous during natural disaster crises where labor is direly needed and gender roles can be very prohibitive. So in climate-related disasters, although queer people have more vulnerabilities than non-queer people, they also possess unique means of coping and resilience. So the literature on people with disabilities and climate change is not unsubstantial. The vulnerabilities of people with disabilities has been noted and acknowledged in many major climate change agreements, including the 2015 Paris Agreement. The literature unveils that practitioners of development and climate change adaptation definitely have an awareness that that disabled people have certain climate change needs, but people with disabilities still represent a social group that is under-considered and have lower visibility in context of adaptation more broadly. So that's despite people with disabilities representing a fairly large population. Nearly 1 in 5 Canadians report living with one or more disabilities. And given that statistic, it seems all the more urgent to think about social inclusion in climate change preparation for disabled people. So the theme of mobility, if we could go to the next slide. Thank you. The theme of mobility is what often emerges when we're talking about people with disabilities and their vulnerabilities in coping with the effects of climate change. At a very literal level, many individuals with physical impairments are just at more inherent risk during natural disasters than people without those same without impairments. So statistics and studies have regrettably reported higher rates of mortality for disabled people during natural disasters and other emergencies. But the issue of mobility for people with disabilities can also speak to lack of capacity and resources, as well as the fact that many people with disabilities are really dependent on place-based services to thrive. So for that first point, it's been shown that people with disabilities often report lower socioeconomic outcomes than people without disabilities. Factors such as a lack of access to economic and social resources, lower amounts of social capital, and more limited autonomy have been identified by studies as having an incredibly negative impact on the resilience of people with disabilities. For that second point, when evacuation becomes necessary or preventative to respond to the effects of climate change, people with disabilities are faced with an incredible amount of disruption because they're reliant on place-based services, accommodations, and infrastructures in order to cope with their disabilities. And so this relocation and displacement present really specific challenges to them. Climate change creates immense need for human mobility, and as environmental degradation compromises the habitability of certain environments and places, and natural disasters raise certain areas entirely, planning for these circumstances should be more inclusive of people with disabilities and their needs. There are also aspects of vulnerability that are given less consideration when talking about the needs of people with disabilities. So aside from individuals with simply mobility impairments, there are actually groups of disabled people whose disabilities render them more vulnerable to disease and who are at greater risk of becoming sick, as climate change tends to promote the spread of illness. Heat emergencies and wildfires have the potential to cause distress and danger to asthmatics, for instance, exacerbating their existing respiratory problems. As well, many individuals who have psychosocial disabilities are at greater risk during heat emergencies because they often take medications which disable their ability to thermoregulate. So with Western Canada having just experienced a very severe heat wave and instances of extreme heat on the rise, these are becoming very pressing issues for us to consider. When talking about disability, it's just not sufficient to only be considering the needs of the physically impaired. We should also be considering the needs of the mentally impaired, as well as impairments that are not as visible. So all this to say, people with disabilities actually still possess very unique modes of resilience. As noted in this quote by Bell, Tabe, and Bell, disabled people are often charged with the position of having to self-advocate and navigate innumerable challenges associated with daily life. So challenges that non-disabled people would not typically consider are all evident to people with disabilities. These skills of self-advocacy and problem solving are definitely assets when trying to include disabled people in climate change planning. And disabled people have immense potential to be active agents of change if offered an opportunity to do so. And I'll try and speed this up here. So racial inequality and environmental injustice are topics which often come hand in hand in the literature. There's many studies being done to examine the impacts of climate change and how climate change reinforces the marginalization of ethnic minorities. Next. So the major factors that impede racial minorities' ability to cope with climate change can be essentially boiled down to lack of resources, economic and otherwise. That lack is due to a number of complex reasons. However, it's really well established by this point that ethnic minority groups are often reporting lower socioeconomic outcomes than non-minority groups. So these populations have less access to food, transportation, healthcare, financial services, and other social services that would help them resist the impacts of climate change. And these populations are just harder to reach because as a consequence of their marginalization, both politically and socioeconomically. So we really need targeted interventions so we can bring them into the fold with regards to social inclusion and planning for climate change impacts. Racial minorities are just in more positions of climate hazard, again, owing to a really broad variety of factors. So for an example of a direct hazard, many ethnic minority groups are employed in occupations which just put them at greater risk for heat stress. So this agricultural industry employs a majority of workers from, for instance, Latin America. Additional vulnerabilities for Latin American migrant workers also arise from linguistic barriers, as linguistic minority groups are often unable to access English media and health messaging, and this impacts their ability and awareness to protect themselves against heat. And another example of how racial minorities are likely to be in more hazardous conditions, a study on urban heat redlining actually revealed that historical practices of disinvestment and systemic racial discrimination in certain US cities has resulted in greater vulnerability to heat. So lower income neighborhoods and cities are often unable to benefit from green spaces, tree canopies, and the materials used to construct these lower income neighborhoods, often concentrated racial minority neighborhoods, are just cheaper and hold heat. So concrete, brick, cinder block. Final slide. So just as with other marginalized groups, ethnic minority communities are more accustomed to various modes of marginalization, and they have their own proprietary modes of resilience to respond. Many activists for racial justice see racial inequality and climate justice as issues that are very deeply intertwined. So climate activism actually has a really strong foundation in the movement for racial justice. And the structures and networks needed to support climate change activism are really well developed amongst members of some ethnic minority groups who have historically had to organize to secure equal treatment and legal rights. Certain ethnic minority communities also have an extensive informal and formal networks, which can be a huge asset when trying to rebuild or recover after natural disasters, whether this be due to cultural factors such as having extended families who are committed to securing the well-beings of their relatives, or social/religious factors such as belonging to church groups or other civil societies. These resources represent crucial modes of support in the event of natural disasters and crises. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anjali. It's so, I saw some of the comments coming in the chat, and I think the words that the people are using are so like reflective and humbling and poignant to really think through a lot of these. And in some cases, I do identify as a racial minority or visible minority. And so some of it's, things that I already think about. And in some of these cases is things we never even would consider. So thank you so much for bringing this so poignantly to the forefront. And I think it's given us a lot of food for thought. Next, I'd like to hand it off to Andrea and Sumira from Can-Mex Youth Lab to share their own reflections and insights and expertise on climate change and the environment.
Thank you so much, Anika, and thanks to the Ontario Council for International Cooperation for having us here today. So the Can-Mex Youth Lab is an initiative of both the Embassy of Canada in Mexico and the Embassy of Mexico in Canada, and it aims to increase collaboration between Mexican and Canadian youth and allow young voices to be heard of across a full range of priority topics, one of them being climate change and sustainability. It also aims to generate lasting bonds between participants and leaders from the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. So to begin with my presentation, as you all heard, I'm a law student, and oftentimes people will ask me, how do you know so much about climate change? My dad even told me one day, I'm a mathematician and you don't see me fighting for climate justice. And in that moment, I thought, well, you should be. So if you're ever wondering, can I advocate for climate justice? Is climate activism for me? The answer is yes. Whether you're an environmental scientist or a teacher, or maybe you're studying literature, or you think you have a master's degree on something that might seem completely unrelated, through this, you should be a climate activist. All of us should be, because no one is truly safe from the climate crisis. Next slide, please. So yes, like I said, all of us are affected by the climate crisis. Unfortunately, there are certain people in certain communities, like Anjali mentioned before, that are far more impacted by climate-driven disasters. This is why we have to advocate for climate justice from an intersectional approach. The way that a rich, white, straight, cis man experiences climate change is completely different than the way that a woman in the global south or a woman in the Pacific Islands more specifically does. But also, not only is the global south affected, there are communities all over the world who suffer the effects of climate change on a larger scale. And that's why climate justice, like it was mentioned previously, is also racial justice, and it's economic justice, and so on. And it's very clear because a few months ago, when some parts of Europe started seeing more of the effects of climate change, suddenly the news was all about it. Because before they would cover climate change, but they would say, oh, it's getting hotter every year, or we're breaking records every year, but they wouldn't necessarily link it to climate change. And suddenly, a few months ago, it was just like the news was saying climate change has arrived, climate change is here. But for these communities, these vulnerable communities, climate change has been here for a long time. Next slide, please. Oh, Nick, thanks. Now, the narrative around climate change is that it's our fault, not only as in humankind's fault, but also as in let's blame individuals. But we are not the only people to hold accountable for the climate crisis. The fossil fuel companies, big corporations, governments who keep investing in those companies, and the richest people, they are emitting a larger amount of CO2 compared to me and compared to you. And sadly, the communities who are most affected by the crisis are the ones who are emitting the least amount of gases. So they are the communities that are contributing the least to the climate crisis. Yes, yet they are the most affected communities. And also, capitalism is setting us for failure, because we shouldn't really blame a person for example, using their car when the distance between their job and their home is 40 minutes by car, and when the public transport system is horrible, and when there's no real infrastructure for bikes. So we shouldn't blame a person for not buying an electric car, because even if in the long run it's cheaper, in that moment when they bought their car, they couldn't afford it. So capitalism and sustainability are not going to be eco-friendly in a capitalist world is very hard. So yes, there are things that we can do and things that we can control. For example, I can walk when it's possible, and I can try to consume less plastic, and I can buy the stuff that I need and not overconsume. But we also need to keep in mind that we also need to hold those who are polluting the most accountable. So for example, the emissions from an 11-minute drive to the grocery store are different than Jeff Bezos' 11-minute trip to space emissions. So are individual actions important? Yes, and you have to act when you can. You have to go vegan if you can, walk when you can, but also don't blame those who maybe can't afford to be more eco-friendly as we'd like. So the moment that you recognize the things that you're doing that are damaging the planet, it also becomes easier to recognize the things that the richest and the governments and the fossil fuel companies are doing to damage the planet too. So it's just easier to recognize who you have to hold accountable and what for. Next slide, please. And a great way to do that is to become a climate activist and advocate for climate justice. Whether you want to advocate for clean energy for all or net zero emissions, there's definitely a place for you when it comes to advocating for climate justice. And there's really not a single way to become an activist, and there's no such thing as a perfect activist, but some of the things that have helped me understand what climate activism and advocacy are, first, to learn to accept all the negative feelings that come with learning about and I'm saying negative because there's no really a thing like a negative feeling, but and accept those feelings that come with learning about the climate crisis. It's very normal to feel overwhelmed and hopeless and angry and sad, and just to think, why is no one doing anything? Like, this is happening right now. People are dying. Why is no one doing anything, but you have to embrace those feelings. And you also have to recognize that you just can't feel like that forever, because the moment that we collectively decide that we're doomed, then it means we are. So start acting. And one way to do that is to look for information that you can understand. And I emphasize that you can understand, because sometimes there are very difficult terms. You can be reading about climate change and just be like, I'm not understanding this. This is very technical, or I'm not a scientist. So look for information that you can understand. It could be an Instagram page that posts infographics that you like, or an article that you found that's easy to read, and then use that information to have uncomfortable conversations. And I say uncomfortable because people don't like to hear that the planet is being ruined, and people will get mad and they will get sad. Most of them will be in denial, but you know, you've been there, so you have to be patient, have those necessary conversations, and find your people through those conversations. I think that one of the reasons why society is the way that it is now is because we're so focused on competing that we've completely forgotten how to cooperate. Imagine if the whole world right now just decided that we are going to do the stuff that we can, and we're also going to hold accountable the richest people, and we're going to end the fossil fuel industry. Things would be very different. So don't try to do it by yourself, not because you can, but because you won't get very far. And find your people, find people who are as concerned, who want to help, who want to learn, and look for local organizations. Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, send them a message. They're not gonna tell you, no, we don't want your help. They're not gonna say that. They're gonna, you know, they need people. So find local organizations, join them. If there isn't any, create your own, and then collaborate with national organizations. And then, you know, now I'm a delegate for the Canmix Youth Lab, and I'm talking to you guys from Mexico. So you see how baby steps can really become larger steps, and you can reach a wider audience. I'm no longer having conversations just with my mom and my dad and my sister. I'm having conversations with all of you. So the important thing at the end of the day is that you just take action, and don't leave your advocacy only to individual actions. Join other people, create your own groups, and create communities, and start advocating for climate justice. Next slide, please. Now, to finish up with my presentation, my accounts on both Twitter and Instagram, that's my handle. So you can send me a message if you're feeling overwhelmed or sad, or you want to collaborate with something, or you want me to send more accounts that I like. And I also wrote down some of my favorite Instagram accounts that post information, very easy to understand information, and also some accounts for organizations in Canada that you can join. So, and it's very easy. You can just look up Climate Action Canada or stuff like that, and you will find organizations that you can join. So now I'm all done. Now I'm passing over the floor to my fellow Can-Mex Lab delegate. The floor is yours.
Hello. I started from the idea that Andrea was going to talk about climate activism. And I don't know if you guys ever feel that, but that feeling when there's a climate march and you feel like you should go, but it's the third one this month and you don't want to go. Or then you feel you should really, or you see something happening and you really think you should organize something, but you don't, it just doesn't feel right. Or that you think, I'm going to try to read this IPCC report, and then you start reading it and it's so dense in information that doesn't interest you. And I just want to talk about finding your place in all of this. The fight against climate change is a massive one. And as Andrea said, everyone's going to have to fight and be active in it. That means every single job, sector. And I did this little graph. It's absolutely not exhaustive. There's so many different ways to help with the environmental problem. But I've kind of divided in 4 different branches. So the technology one is one that is going to be super important. We have a huge problem, and we live in a technologically based society. We'll have to remediate, we'll have to lower our impacts. And if you're the kind of person who really enjoys engineering, math, and you're not comfortable going out on the street screaming, or you're really happy behind your computer, that's a great way to help. That's absolutely, and we'll absolutely need your help. If you're also a bit more introvert and like researching, and your academic research will show us the path where to go. First, we have to understand what's wrong. We have to understand why it's happening, and we have to find solutions and compare solutions. I don't know if you know this feeling when you have a plastic bag or a paper bag compared to a cotton bag, and you're not sure which one you should buy or choose because you forgot yours at home. That's a super small scale, but then on the larger scale, should we have carbon caps or carbon taxes? These are things that have to be modeled and researched. So if that's your thing, we need you. Habitual change, that's usually activism, or usually we talk a lot about bottom-up things, voting with your wallet, buying things that you believe in. But there's also super interesting top-down solutions, which for example, urbanism. I find that one super fascinating. With a small example, you have, if you walk into a building, well, that's more architecture, but if you walk into a building and you see stairs first, or if you see the elevator first, it'll make a big difference on which one you will take. That's a small thing. Bigger things, I'm currently in the Netherlands, and the whole infrastructure, the whole cities are built around the bike. If you're walking, you feel kind of weird. If you're driving, there's bikes around you all the time, super stressful. So everything, you go outside your house and the first thing you see is the bike lane. Everything is built for bikes. And that makes a super big difference. I come from a smaller Canadian city where you have one building, a parking, a house, a parking. So if you want to go anywhere, you have to pass so many parkings that the distances are almost unbikeable. So there's cool things you can do from top down. And then policy, I think if we're all here, we're a bit interested in policy. But that too has a huge array of things you can focus on and how to address the problem. And all of these solutions will be needed. Example for carbon dioxide emissions, you can build carbon markets like Europe is doing right now, and how Quebec and California are doing together. You can put carbon caps or put laws that make it illegal to buy new fuel cars. And you can work on PR campaigns and communication and try to get people to change their habits. And all three of them are absolutely necessary. One doesn't work without the other. So, especially in policy, you have to, however, be kind of conscious of all the other parts. If you want to write effective policy, it has to really know what's the problem, how to deal with it. So a tool we can go to the next slide. A tool I really like for this is the Dipster Model. I don't know if any of you already know it, and it's something you can look up online. And it's a really good tool to be conscious of every aspect of a problem, because in policy, you're looking for solutions, and the solutions have to address every part of the problem. So first of all, you have to know what causes this, what exactly causes this. You have to know what's the impact on the environment. We know plastic is wrong, but why exactly? What does it do to the environment? And then we have to see where the environment is. What's the state of the environmental problem? How many forests are being chopped down? What's the climate? How warm are we already? And we have to know how it impacts people, and help for remediation. Next slide. So yeah, that was really my thing, what I wanted to share with you. It's a huge fight. Everyone has to focus. Everyone has to find what feels natural to them and what gives them energy. If you do something you hate, it's not going to help. So find something that gives you energy and makes you happy. And it's a marathon. We're going to have to fight for this our whole life. And the happier you are while doing it, the more people will want to join you. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, Andrea and Sumira. It's always such a pleasure, and I think it's really valuable how you've made some of these pieces so accessible and so relatable. I think it is very easy in the climate activism space to get lost in well, what's the point of me as an individual, choosing a paper bag over a plastic bag when everything is falling apart, and sometimes it feels a little apocalyptic. But I think this is a great reminder that yes, we can hold that acknowledgement that it's not our individual responsibility, while still taking the steps to do better and to push for bigger change. So thank you so much for that insight and that reflection. It's so powerful to hear from you folks. And last but not least, I'd like to hand it off to Laura Hernandez and Kristyn Ng from the Jane Goodall Institute of Canada's Youth Advisory Council to share their insights as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having us tonight, and I'm really happy that I get to hear all the other presentations. Laura just signed on, I see. So I'll let Laura begin.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everybody. As we were graciously introduced, we are here on behalf of the Youth Advisory Council from the Jane Goodall Institute of Canada. My name is Laura Hernandez Merlano. She, her pronouns is the pronouns that I use. And Kristyn?
Yeah, and I'm Kristyn Ng, and I also use she, her pronouns.
Perfect. And we're here to talk a little bit about our experience in the climate policy space, so specifically for youth mobilization.
Right, so I can see now that.
And just a quick disclaimer.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I think there might be a bit of a lag on my end, but just a quick disclaimer that we do share a couple of photos of Jane Goodall herself interacting with animals, and we just want to be clear and give a quick disclaimer that we don't endorse interacting with wildlife, including chimpanzees, and if you are to encounter one, please keep a safe and respectful distance.
Great, thanks, Laura. So now that I see that the agenda is up on the slide, and we just wanted to walk you through what our presentation is going to look like. So first, we're just going to take a couple minutes to introduce the Institute itself, the Roots and Shoots program, and the Youth Advisory Council, which is the part that Laura and I participate in. And then we're going to talk about what I hope everyone here is really interested in, how we can engage in climate action policy as young people. Okay, so next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, and then one more. Great. Okay, so who we are. So the Jane Goodall Institute is a nonpartisan NGO that was founded in 1977 by Dr. Jane Goodall herself. She is an ethologist, a humanitarian, a conservationist, and a UN peace messenger. And she tries to promote her message of hope in all that she does. And our work here is there to promote the conservation of chimpanzees, the understanding of them with our human nature, as well as other great apes. And her Roots and Shoots programs aim to empower the next generation of conscious citizens, and especially youth, to believe in her holistic approach of protecting animals, people, and the environment as a whole. Next slide, please. Thanks.
Perfect. And this is a little bit of an insight on what our approach is as an institute. So as a global conservation organization that's deeply invested in a better future for all youth, JGI Canada recognizes that the climate crisis itself isn't a singular issue existing in a vacuum. So instead, we face the convergence of three larger crises, which is what you can see here in the circles and in the diagram. We have climate change, we have biodiversity loss, and we have environmental inequity, which is led by the concept of One Health approach. So JGI Canada, through our programming, is addressing these three crises as a complex system that's deeply interconnected. And they all individually within their intersections, and then all together, need diverse and science-based solutions.
Next slide, please. Thank you. So Roots and Shoots is really a global flagship program at the Jane Goodall Institute. There's many that exist in different countries around the world. It's a very flexible program that follows this four-step approach to empower young people to be agents of change in their own communities. That change can be at a local or global scale by allowing young people to identify what problems they have in their community and how they can put a positive impact on that. Anyone can participate. We have young people from pre-kindergarten all the way to 30 plus who participate in our programs. Really, any change matters, and it can happen at any age.
Perfect. So a little bit more about our APE grants specifically. So anyone can participate in Roots and Shoots and gain access to our APE Fund community grants, where each project is eligible for up to $1,000 in funding. And between 2020 and 2021, the APE Fund supported over 150 Roots and Shoots projects across Canada. So the applications open usually in the late fall of each year, and then the grant money is awarded in early on in the following year. And the year-end reports are then due in June of the same year. So if you're more interested in the APE Fund community grants and you think that you have a project that you would appreciate the resources, please head on over to rootsandshoots.ca. And of course, we encourage for your project to hit more than one theme, as I spoke about previously with the One Health approach. We absolutely love to see projects that face those intersectional lenses.
Great. So just to talk a bit more about the Youth Advisory Council, it's a council that's comprised of 12 young people across all of Canada. So we work with people across the nation between the ages of 18 to 25. And these terms are on a one-year basis. So if you are interested, please do feel free to apply for the next cohort, which should be next June. It's a really great opportunity where you are given the resources and you are empowered by the staff and the Institute itself to really see your visions through, your initiatives, your events, and your goals. And Laura and I are really going to talk about an example that we found to be really rewarding when we were part of the council. Next slide, please.
Perfect. So a couple of examples you can see here on the slide, but I'll speak to just a few. So our impact, and last year, it was really a unique experience because we worked across Canada, 12 youth. And so we were very excited to bring a lot of different initiatives to the table. But I think that personally, some of the most rewarding were definitely one of the pieces of our advocacy series, which was called Mobilizing Youth for Climate Justice, was when we actually ended up drafting a letter with 12 other youth organizations that we drafted and finalized. And then this letter was sent to senators and MPs that were trying to pass Bill C-20 that really focused on a just recovery from COVID-19 that really centered around focusing Indigenous-led conversations and Indigenous-led engagement, as well as uplifting general climate justice lens to the COVID recovery itself. Second, we had our What's in My Backyard webinars, which was really exciting because we had classrooms across the country that participated and that engaged with our episodes. And then finally, we were actually able to give strategic planning directly into board meetings and CEOs, and we had the opportunity to really shape how to include youth voices and make sure that youth voices and the youth lens was put right at the beginning of the strategic planning for the following years.
Great. You can skip a couple more slides. So now we're just going to kind of talk about Perfect. Okay, so this slide is really intended to help everybody on this call really understand if they have a passion or an issue they see in their community, like a gap that they think that they can fulfill in that climate action and climate justice space. They can utilize these 4 steps to really see that vision through. So I'm going to walk us through an example of what we are able to do on the Youth Advisory Council, just being 12 young people who are able to come together, organize, and really kind of do something great. So the first thing in the steps is, oh, sorry, you can go back one. It's all on one slide. Thank you. So the first step is to engage and inspire. So what we were inspired by, we wanted to engage with political advocacy specifically, and we were inspired by the potential in reforming policies that we were reading at the federal level. Then we were to observe and map. So we researched current bills that were on the table, and we observed that there's a lack of priority, specifically in Bill C-12, which talks about bringing Canada to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. We saw that there's a lack of accountability in this bill, and we wanted to see something change. So in that same breath, we took action by writing an op-ed voicing our concerns about Bill C-12 as young people. And it was actually published in the Hill Times for parliamentarians to read and really understand. Then we used this letter to reach out to other MPs in our local ridings, which was very, very powerful, and got the attention of Elizabeth May, who was the former Green Party leader. Very amazing woman, and we got the chance to interview her, and she gave us tips that we got to share with our networks, and it's on our social medias of what she thought could be a helpful way for young people just like you to engage in climate action and make a meaningful impact in that space. And the fourth thing, which is really important, is to celebrate your impact. I feel like young people always volunteer our time to efforts and passions that we find to be important. And it's important to celebrate the achievements that you've made to keep that energy going, because I know previous presenters have talked about burnout. So we haven't had the chance to celebrate yet due to the climate of the situation, but we hope to do it in the new year. So next slide, please.
And just a quick point before we move on to building relationships, I think Kristyn and I also talk about that all the time. Like we're so busy, and a lot of the time we're so focused and we're so ambitious, and every time something gets done, we're like, okay, wow, we got it done. Let's move on to the next thing. But it's really important to just stop, pause, rest. You know, rest is a form of revolution and a form of resistance. I love that quote. And I think that it's important to share that with your circle, share that with your community. And it brings us to our next point, which is building relationships. So I think a really big part of our work with the Institute was these workshops as well that were brought in, that were Indigenous-led workshops to help decolonize our workspace, to help decolonize our personal lives. And a really big part of that was to decolonize networking. And we're taught that a lot of the time relationships and networking has to be very transactional, but I think we really got our perspective changed, or I can at least speak to myself, and my perspective was very much changed on this because we really realized that what building relationships about, what networking is really just about devoting your time to learn about the vision and the goals of your community and uplifting each other, and really making sure that where is it that your mission and your mandates align, and how can you uplift each other. Another really big thing that we definitely learned about was that it's really important to understand that we may not be seeing youth in very many decision-making spaces, but decision makers are very much in this new, I would say, like a newer space where they're definitely recognizing that there's a need for youth voices. And a lot of people are waiting and are looking, and they don't really know where to look. So it's important for you to really reach out to have your voice heard. So we were a little bit intimidated at first, but we definitely would just encourage everybody to think big when you're looking at engaging in not just political spaces, but specifically in the political space. Don't be shy to approach your MP, especially if you're within that riding. You don't have to be of voting age to be considered a constituent, to have your voice heard in your constituency. Reach out to senators that are working on specific bills. Make sure that your voice is being heard. Reach out to party leaders. We were a bit intimidated definitely to speak to Elizabeth May, but she was more than excited when she heard of all the work that we were doing and wanted to sit down and have a conversation with us. So just don't be afraid, because decision makers do want to hear from youth. We just need to be giving them those opportunities, and we need to be just consistently showing up so that they recognize that. And people are starting to see this shift where they really do see youth as capable, intelligent, ambitious, and not just that we're lacking experience, but we have our own lived experience, and we bring our own lived experience to the table that adds that extra je ne sais quoi. And a really big thing that'll push us on to our next slides as well is amplifying voices. So a really big part of relationship building and a really big part of amplifying voices, and these two go hand in hand, is that you don't necessarily have to start a new thing. You don't necessarily have to find something that people aren't doing yet. You know, I think that we have a lot of pressure sometimes to do that, but it doesn't hurt to just, when you're mapping your community and you're looking at what's going on the table and in your local communities and your grassroots organizations, what are people already doing that you can support with your time and that you can support with your resources? What can you amplify? And more particularly with Indigenous-led organizations and with BIPOC-led organizations, underserved communities, marginalized groups, queer spaces, how can we make sure that those voices that are traditionally the most oppressed and the most oppressed are being heard? So it's definitely, obviously, I mean, not so obvious to some spaces, but to us, it was very important to amplify Indigenous voices in climate action because they hold such a deep relationship to the land, and they're the ones that really understand the land's needs, limits, and terms of preservation. So we were really able to connect with them to understand how to have effective traditional land use and conservation knowledge, and how can we spotlight that in the fight towards climate change. So another really big point that I'd like to bring up in this is when you do amplify those voices, when you do have, thank you for the quick reminder, Kyle, we will keep it in mind. We're just about to wrap up. But when you do have those consultations with Indigenous organizations or with BIPOC organizations, a lot of those organizations are tired, are under-resourced, are overworked. And so it is important to pay people for their time and for their labor. And so especially coming from an organization where we did have resources and we did have a little bit more resources than the traditional youth organization, I would say, we definitely made sure that we were making sure to, provide honorariums and pay people for their time and for their space and for their consultations. And just making sure as well, and it's been brought up a couple times, is just be very conscious and practicing awareness around emotional labor. which is a really big part to that. And I'll let Kristyn just wrap up quickly. I think she had one last point before we move on to the next slide.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Just concluding overall, Laura touched on this, but the intersection of building relationships and with that trust that you gain from building that deep relationship, especially with Indigenous groups who have historically been manipulated or taken advantage of, and they don't necessarily feel that trust to certain groups of people who decide to reach out. It's really important to build that foundation and really building that trust and then knowing that you're going to amplify their values and really help them see it through. That is equally good than creating your own avenues, like Laura mentioned. It was very fulfilling and very powerful for us to uplift really good work that just didn't get that spotlight. So that's equally good. That's all I just want to say. So this last slide is just our social medias. We want you to stay in touch. You can reach out to Laura and I personally. We'd love to house any questions, how to get in touch with the Roots and Shoots program or JGIC as a whole. And please feel free to follow us on the other social media platforms for news of what we're doing. Thanks so much for having us tonight. I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, we can't emphasize it enough. Kristyn and I are on the youth cohort for another year. So we would really love to hear from other youth organizations speaking right to our presentation and hear from you and learn how we can amplify your projects. How can you amplify ours? How can we work together? How can we build relationships and build safe spaces for youth that really feel like they're being heard in political spaces, which is sometimes difficult to feel like we're being heard or we're being put in decision-making spaces. Thank you, everyone.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much to Kristyn and Laura for that incredible presentation. I see those little clapping emojis in the group here. So thank you so much. I think for me, it was really interesting to see the richness with which the Jane Goodall program, the Roots and Shoots program goes in, and also has me reflect on, as someone who has the honor and privilege of working with young people, but also I think for many of the young people on this call, how they can take their programs and their initiatives and make it reach more deeply and more effectively, I think, touch on the experiences of people who are most affected. So thank you so much to all of our incredible speakers. It's been such an honor to hold this space thus far. What I'd like to do now is actually, I will stop sharing the screen and I'll invite folks to share any questions or thoughts that they may have as Kyle works on putting us into breakout rooms. In these breakout rooms, which will not be recorded, you will have the opportunity to to take part in a short guided facilitation with one of our speaking organizations. And you'll have a chance to kind of share your reflections and thoughts and feedback and best practices. But while that's getting set up, I'd like to open the floor now if anyone has any questions or reflections for our speakers. Feel free to unmute yourself or drop questions in the chat. I can monitor that as well.
Hi, I'm Shatabdi. I have a really quick question that's kind of just for anybody. Where do you sort of see the climate journey for all of us really going in the future, especially considering the election coming, and for youth as well? Yeah.
I mean, I would love to jump in on that in terms of specifically for the election coming up. I would say that something that I'm really excited to see this election, and I hope to see in future elections and in general in the political space, is the recognition that the climate policy space is not a partisan issue. This is an issue that affects every single party, every single population, every single group of constituents. And it's about time that every single party recognizes that. And I think that what we're seeing here is that as parties don't recognize this, they're really falling behind with the youth vote demographic. And that youth vote is going to be lacking because we are putting that pressure. And I think that it's really great to see that, as we mentioned in this earlier presentations, not everybody feels like they have the space or the knowledge or the experience to be a climate advocate, but everyone cares about climate. If you look at the results from not just youth voters, but from voters across Canada, people really care about what the future of Canada's climate policy is going to be like. And not just on an international level, because we advocate a lot at the international level, but also within our domestic space and what we do here here at home. And that was what a really big part of Bill C-12 that I encourage you guys to look at if you're not familiar with, was bringing that accountability to Canadian policy and making sure that we're not just passing bills, but we're also holding our parliament and our bureaucracy accountable for making sure that our targets are being met.
Something that I'll add on really quickly is that I feel like with that question, it's difficult to feel burnt out and just not necessarily feel motivated anymore. But even just hearing today during the orientation that I had for a program of mine, a lot of stakeholders in the environmental space, whether it was consulting, whether it was the government, whether it was conservation, NGO work, there's all people who are saying how there is so much more movement and promotion in the idea and need for this kind of work. And something that a professor told me a while back, which has really kept my motivation high, is that we are going to be the next decision makers. People in this call are the people who already have this compassion and knowledge of the environment and the crises that we face. So that should give you a lot of hope that we're moving towards a really, really great place. And it's in our hands. And if we all have these views right now, then we're looking good and we're looking forward. So just stay hopeful.
Incredible. Thank you. Yes, Zarina, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much to everyone for the presentations. It was really amazing to get a huge amount of information, definitely a lot to reflect on. I just have a question for Anjali. I wanted to ask sort of about your research methods and sort of where you got your data from and what that process generally looked like to help you arrive at such grand and important conclusions.
Yeah, definitely. So it was a process, I have to admit, I was completely new to. I'm really only entering my third year of undergraduate. So there's a lot of guidance from my amazing supervisor, Anjali Mehindiratta, who's the gender lead for IISD's resilience team. Basically, our research consisted of just creating a list of key terms that related to what we were interrogating on. So we were looking up SOGI-ESC, which is sexual characteristics and other sexual minorities, plus environmental degradation, plus hurricanes, plus typhoons. And so we kept finding, we were most interested in finding events and case studies rather than kind of more general literature. There's a lot of literature actually coming out of the Antipodes, so Australia, New Zealand, on the relationship between LGBTQ plus people and environmental degradation and climate change, because Australia and New Zealand are often have experienced, I feel like, climate change more acutely and earlier than maybe other countries. And there was just a lot of the research on that topic began there. Our research really began with LGBTQ plus people, and then we took it to other minority groups, such as people with disabilities, ethnic minorities. There's always more marginalized communities that we don't get to investigate as often, but we were really super intrigued by how these often overlooked groups are affected by climate change. And just to reference what Laura and Kristyn were talking about, everyone's affected by climate change. We all have the ability to be advocates. And what I'm hoping for in the election in Canadian climate change policy is that we take a more concerted look at these marginalized communities who are going to be the most affected, who are already feeling the most severe effects of climate change. Thank you for your question.
Thanks so much. Well, with that, I am going to just drop a link to a Jamboard that you will be using in your breakout rooms. And I invite Kyle to open up the breakout rooms where you'll have a chance to engage with some of these speakers more deeply. Welcome back, everyone. I was popping in and looking at some of the Jamboard slides, and it looks like there have been some really, really fruitful questions or conversations. So I'd actually love to open up the floor for maybe one person from each group or each breakout room to share some things that resonated with them, reflections, thoughts. So I'd like to invite somebody from Anjali's group. Feel free to unmute yourself or drop some thoughts or reflections in the chat as well.
I can go ahead in the absence of anyone else, but I will preface by saying that I didn't really take notes. So if I skip over something, I do apologize. We had a really fantastic discussion though. Anjali, thank you so much for answering all of our questions before we even began with the ones on the Jamboard. So we talked a lot about how we were disappointed but not surprised with a lot of the findings in terms of the way that a lot of marginalized groups are being treated. Especially because, you know, these are things that we had heard of in the news in the past or things that we could have anticipated based on the things that we do know about access to social resources and economic resources and stuff like that. And then we did also talk about the intersection with racial injustice and what it looks like for the environmental movement moving forward in terms of finding sustainable solutions, but also finding a collaborative solution that isn't just dumping all of your problems in another part of the world. I think that's all, although I think I missed a big chunk at the beginning.
That's great. I think that's amazing. And even looking at the Jamboard, which will be shared with everyone. So even if you weren't part of this breakout room, you'll have the chance to read through the thoughts. It seems like there were a lot to unpack there. So thank you so much, Serena, for sharing. Is there somebody who would like to share from Kristyn and Laura's breakout room?
Sorry, I was on mute. No, I was saying meeting youth at their point of congregation or where sort of they kind of congregate. Some of the approaches we've used is the cyber spaces, online spaces, virtual spaces. And someone in our group mentioned TikTok being a prime example. So if you wanted, say, a 15-second TikTok video on climate change issue, on the environment, and you actually maybe engage youth that are interested in how to make this video, but then have an environmental issue attached to it, that would be pretty exciting for them. And we've run some virtual sessions during COVID. It's been amazing, the turnout for youth, even in the evenings. And you'd think they won't turn up. So usually if you've got these webinars and whatever, but if they're well facilitated with folks, and sometimes we have some swear to give away and stuff like that. But it's not so much that, it's running maybe these puzzles in between, like substantive stuff, some activities that actually engage the youth has been very important. But on a practical level too, outside of the cyberspaces, I find just going to basketball courts, you know, and talking to youth, going to sort of sports field or where they hang out, where they do their hip hop, R&B sessions and rhyming or wherever, depending on your community. And just engaging them in conversations around that and developing maybe material that speaks to them in a way that speaks to them, but raising sort of these kind of issues that might not necessarily come immediate to their mind, I think has worked.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think that's super comprehensive and I think touches on a lot of the lessons learned or the best practices that any of you can put into practice when you're doing work with young people. And last but not least, if there's anyone who would like to share from Andrea and Sumira's breakout room, please feel free. You seem to have a shy group. So maybe Andrea or Sumira, if either of you would like to share some of the conversation points.
Yeah, well, we talked about what was the environmental problem that we were the most passionate about. Some people said diseases and what how, like the link between climate and climate-driven diseases, and also animal agriculture, how it affects specifically children. A very important point about climate education, how many people don't really have the resources to really know a lot about climate change. And we also did a little Dipster model where our problem was climate change, and the drivers are fossil fuels, more CO2 emissions, and it leads to more severe disasters, droughts, floods, and how we can solve it through, for example, policy and so on. I don't know if Sumira, you'd like to add something else.
Amazing. Well, it seems like very fruitful conversation. So thank you all for taking part and for engaging so fully and so holistically. Before we do close, I want to just launch a quick poll to see your own reflections or thoughts on today's session. So please, you should be seeing the poll pop up on your screen right now. Please do feel free to go through and respond to each of these questions just to get a sense of how effective we were today in helping you learn more about the topic at hand. Please let me know if you have any questions or concerns with accessing the poll. I already see some thoughts and some responses coming in as well. And just a note, none of these poll responses are identified, so all of these are anonymous. So please feel free to respond as frankly and as honestly as you'd like. Incredible. Maybe another 5 or so seconds for those of you who are just responding. Fantastic. So I won't be sharing these responses unless folks really want to know, but this is just for our internal reporting and tracking. So thank you all for being here. But with that, I'd actually once again like to thank all of you for making it, and specifically thank our speakers, Andrea, Sumira, Anjali, Laura, and Kristyn, for your expertise and your insight. I think I've learned so much today. I feel like even the way that I run my youth programming, the way that I engage with other young people has been pushed a little bit and has been encouraged to seek out more reflective and accurate and comprehensive ways specifically related to climate change and the environment. So thank you all for being here and for engaging, and to all of you that are attending, I hope that today's session was useful and valuable. If you found today's session interesting and you'd like to know more about different topics, we have a whole series of events coming up. The next session will be happening next week on Thursday at the same time. And the topic of discussion will be truth and reconciliation. And so we're very excited to have several young Indigenous youth come and share their own perspectives and their expertise with us. So please feel free to join and register. Kyle will be dropping the link to register in the chat if you have not registered already. And we have several other events coming up in October and November that might pique your interest. So please do stay in touch, stay involved. And with that, I wish you all a great Thursday evening, and thank you all for joining today. Have a good one.
Thank you.